My name is Pat Dowell. I'm the 3rd Ward Alderman, and I want to welcome you to this community presentation on the Central Station project. A couple of things I want to say before we get started. If you drove this evening and you are parked, you can get parking validation at the front table on your way out from Brian Friedman, who works on my staff. Brian, could you raise your hand? Actually, come up, Brian, real quick. Tomorrow, the presentation that you see this evening will be available. There's Brian, for those of you looking for Brian. Thank you, Brian. Tomorrow, the presentation you see tonight will be on our email website, which is ward03chicago.com. ward03chicago.com. And because we were trying to start on time, if you didn't sign up or do the sign-in sheet, and you want to be on the email list for this particular project, you should stop at the desk on the way out and just give us your email address so that we can make sure that we count you in on the email list. So again, thank you for coming this evening. And I know you all are very interested in seeing the landmark development proposal, so I'm not going to take up a lot of your time. But I thought it was important to take this opportunity to frame what you are about to see. This is a proposal. Let me repeat. This is a proposal. Nothing more than that. It is in its infancy, and any development over the tracks must go through many approval processes or approval stages before it even comes to the city council. So I want you to understand that. This is not the last time that the One Central Station development project will be reviewed by the public or the city of Chicago. Another important thing to remember is that Landmark already owns the air rights over the Metro tracks. Bob Dunn and Landmark came to me with an idea for this property. I have asked them, as I do with all developers who come into the 3rd Ward, to come to the community and get feedback before submitting any official documents to the city for consideration. That is what they are doing today, reviewing a development proposal for a project on private property. There are, of course, limitations on what can be built on the property, and legal restrictions and covenants that the developers must adhere to. Specifics on those regulations will be addressed by Landmark Development tonight. Also, please know that I have not, and I repeat, have not signed off on any aspect of this proposal. Development over the tracks must receive my support before moving forward. No backroom deals have been struck. There are no handshake agreements on this project. God knows that I will hold him and his development accountable to the needs of my constituents first and foremost. The size, shape, scope, and design of this project are all open for discussion. I encourage your constructive and open-minded suggestions for this currently underutilized property. And that is what this property is. It's underutilized. There is so much potential for this space. This is an initial discussion on what can be done to make the area better, both for the residents of this community and the entire city of Chicago. Remember, this is just an initial step of what will be a long process before anything is done over the Metro tracks. So without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Bob Dunn of Landmark Development to begin the presentation. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. Bob?
number of these meetings. I would echo what Alderman Dowell said, which is I too would encourage an open and honest dialogue about the issues that you see as we present some of the ideas that we've had. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what I'd like to cover tonight. We'll make a brief presentation. I want to speak directly to some of the subjects that I expect that you will have concerns about and ideas of your own. And then, as Alderman Dowell said, we'll open it up for questions and answers. I also want to thank Alderman Dowell, and I would agree with absolutely every word that she said. It was made clear to me very early on. We will be methodical. We will be transparent. We will work at a pace that she dictates for us. We're not in a sprint here. This is more like a marathon. And my hope would be that working with the community together, we'll organize a plan that realizes the opportunity that this site presents, not just for those of you here in the neighborhood, but for the broader community at large. So with that, I'll walk through the presentation quickly. A couple of topics that we'll speak to. I'll give you a very brief background on my experience and that of my company, as well as the project team that we've organized for this project. Talk a little bit about some of the principles, basically things that we have learned as we've been working on this over the last number of months and actually now almost a couple of years. I'd like to talk about some of the planning considerations. As I said, some of the key issues that we've identified that we expect to hear from you on. Talk a little bit about opportunities. What do we imagine? When we look at this site, after having done the homework that we've done on this, and then at the end I'll share with you some of the visuals that we shared with the media today. I cannot say it strongly enough. These are nothing more than ideas at this point. This is the beginning of a process. It's not the end of a process. I think you'll find, working with myself and our team, what we look for is a strong and positive engagement with the community. So a little bit of background. I've had the good fortune over the years of working on a number of large economic development projects. Unlike many developers who build office buildings, residential, retail, and what have you, our work has been a little different than that. Most of our projects are centered on urban development around some kind of civic institution. Oftentimes it's stadiums, arenas, convention centers. Sometimes it's healthcare, higher education. So our experience is a little bit different, and frankly, I'm accustomed to working in a forum like this where these projects have a strong amount of engagement with the community. We've organized a team here in Chicago that I think is, best in class. A deep roster of experience in Chicago on projects of all types and all sizes. The other point that I would mention, having worked on a number of large economic development projects over the years, we have built a diverse team. That's something that every major project that we're involved in, that is always one of the major elements of how we put projects like this together. I think if you can read the slide, it represents the breadth of not just the experience on the team, but the diversity on the team. And it's something that we'll have a program, what we call a targeted business and workforce participation program, that matches what we've done in other markets. And this is something that we've had a high degree of success with. This example is a project that we're wrapping up now in Minneapolis, U.S. Bank Stadium. I'm very pleased with the results that we had there. Goals were set high in a community with a very different demographic profile than what we have here in Chicago or Detroit, New York, some of the other markets that we've worked in. We exceeded our goals in Minneapolis by a considerable margin. That's not something that just happens. It comes together as a result of the programs that we put in place and how we manage those programs. So we will have high expectations for what we can accomplish here in Chicago with our targeted business and workforce participation program. The site, I don't imagine I have to explain to many of you in the room the site. Just to give you some parameters, I think there have been a number of questions here in the last few weeks since this leaked out in the media as to where the site is. Just to give you broad parameters, Lakeshore Drive is our eastern boundary. The site basically starts at the southern end at the north wall of McCormick Place. The best boundary I can give you on the west is the CN line, the Canadian National line that comes along the western edge of the site. And our site continues basically up to McFetridge at the north. It does not continue up to Roosevelt. I think there's been some confusion over what the boundaries are of the site and do we go that far north. The site does not continue up to Roosevelt. We tried to put together a series of diagrams here to help provide some orientation of the site as it exists today and how we've thought about improving the site. What is it that we envision building there? And how do we solve this infrastructure issue that exists because of the existing railroad infrastructure that Metra has on site? So you're looking at, go back to you, you're looking at a perspective from the east, from the southeast, looking down on the site, Lakeshore Drive, McCormick Place, the CN line, through the park, and then up to McFetridge. So what you see, 18th Street connection here, the rail platform, the underpass here, Waldron Drive, obviously Soldier Field. I wanted to start with this slide, just picking up on Alderman Dowell's comments, and I cannot stress this strongly enough. The work that we have done to date has focused almost entirely on building an understanding of the issues in and around the site. It has not been focused on architecture, it has not been focused on program, it has not been focused on organizing a plan that we can take to the city. We spent a lot of time gaining an understanding of the site. It's a very complicated site. It takes time to work through that. We've done our homework, and all this graphic is trying to represent is, generally speaking, where are we today and where are we going? And so the point that I would make is, when we say project definition, the things that we've done are land use planning, investigating the site, some preliminary engineering, how can we deal with the track infrastructure, transportation planning, assessing the zoning, beginning to look at building massing, and then conceptual master plan. I will show you tonight the work that we have been doing so you understand and you're at the same point in time that we are at. The point that I will stress is we are here. As Alderman Dowell said, it's a long process. There's nothing that comes together quickly. I was advised by many people last year, let's move on this, let's get something into the city, let's try and drive this forward. That is not the approach that we have chosen to take on this. We wanted to get educated on the site and organize enough information that we could come to a meeting like this, share what we've learned, expose and express some ideas that we've had in terms of development, and now start to work through a process where we can basically begin to look at what I call the civic architecture of the site. We know the mechanics of the inner workings of the site. My hope is that together we can work with the community to begin to identify goals and objectives and to have an engagement with the community. And when I say community, I mean our project team, community organizations, the civic and cultural institutions, neighborhood groups, and the city of Chicago. We need to gain that input and that understanding before we can begin to develop a detailed plan of any type. So that is what we, in my mind, and that is the process that we're beginning this evening. From here, what we would like to do, go back if you would, what we would like to do is work with the community to organize what we call a community development plan. When we've done these other large projects in the past, this is something that we've organized that is intended to build a bridge between the project ideas and interests, community ideas and interests, and the issues with the city and other planning organizations that we have to work to as we begin to advance a project. So the next step for us is we'd like to work together to organize a community development plan. And then, eventually, we get into design and engineering, entitlements with the city, public approvals, and eventually you go on and complete final design and onto construction. Someone, I'm sure, will ask me a question tonight. What is the time frame that we intend to move on? I couldn't answer that with any absolutes tonight. You know, I'd like to work at a at a reasonable pace. We'd like to work efficiently. We'd like to have an open and transparent process. We'd like to learn what we can learn. I think the time frame will guide itself. I'm asked that question all the time, and I want to be, responsive. I don't think I could stand here tonight and honestly say, in X months we'll be here, and in Y months we'll be there. The process will dictate the timing that we follow. So in terms of the site and what we see when we look at the development opportunity here, I think this graphic explains it probably as well as it can be explained. What we refer to as one central, to put an identity on this 34 acres, as we began to do our analysis of the site, what we came to understand that frankly I didn't fully appreciate when we got started is this is not just 34 acres in the heart of one of the great cities of the world. It has a much broader set of interests and opportunities, and I think that the slide really frames it well. Number one, we have come to learn and appreciate the opportunity that transit can provide with this site, number one. Number two, the civic interests in and around this site are probably unmatched by any other site that I could identify in the country. That's a very unique condition and situation. And the third is how this project can have a very positive impact on the community. When I say community, I mean the nearby neighborhood and the broader community beyond. And I'll walk through some of the work that we've done on this. This, to me, is what differentiates this site, not just among other sites here in Chicago, but in many respects, I don't know that I couldn't identify another site here in the U.S. that I think has the same makeup in this respect as this site does. And so the importance of this site, I think, requires that we take a very deliberate approach to how we build a plan for the future development of this site. In the path along the way, in terms of getting educated on this, mobility is probably the biggest lesson learned. When you look at the site, this image is shot from the south over McCormick Place looking due north, Lakeshore Drive to your right, the CN line to your left. You ask yourself the most obvious question, why has this site not been developed? Lakeshore Drive address, at the doorstep of the parks in a mature neighborhood, in the heart of a city, I can walk to the civic interests of the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, things that all of you know. And the answer, obviously, is the site has not been developed because of the presence of the entire Weldon Yard operation, Metra's Weldon Yard operation on the site. It's not at all uncommon in Chicago to have active rail that comes through a site and you've built over, buildings have been built over active rail all over the city. The entire city practically has been built on elevated structure when you go back in time. This site is not unlike a lot of the development that has occurred in Chicago for 100+ years. What is different about this site is just the magnitude of the site covered by the Metro tracks. And that has been the limiting condition. At the same time, it is probably also the greatest opportunity with the site as we've studied it. You go back in time, this was Central Station. What you come to realize fairly quickly is that the intersection of rail infrastructure here is probably unmatched in Chicago. It would be hard to find a comparable site here in the U.S. that has the various linkages of rail infrastructure already in place. And so it's both, what has been the challenge, and it's also the opportunity. The next point on community, or civic places, is this next slide, I think, says it well. Again, nothing that you don't all know and understand very well, but the presence of world-class civic institutions on the lakefront is probably unmatched here in the country, all in a walkable footprint. That creates a different set of issues, but also opportunities for the development of this site. You bring upwards of 50 million people a year to the lakefront. I don't, off the top of my head, have another example of where that many people move to a single location, visitors, on an annual basis. It's just an extraordinarily high number. The other examples that I could give you, are just, they don't compare. So that means many things, right? It means people, traffic, movement, noise, etc., in and around the neighborhood. And at the same time, it presents opportunity to create a development and to build the kind of amenity set that these kinds of civic institutions will need in order to continue to evolve and grow their operating business. This is something we have a lot of experience with, and I think in this case we see both challenges and opportunities that we would like to address as we begin to take the plan forward. And the third point is community. What's interesting to us is it's sort of a hole in the donut theory. This site is surrounded by the character-defining elements of the city of Chicago. You've got the core of downtown minutes away. You've got the lakefront, Lakeshore Drive, the civic institutions. You've got a very mature and growing neighborhood to the west. And to the south, you've got an opportunity for growth, economic development, etc., that a project like this can help realize. Usually when we look at projects like this, you have much more of an inward focus. In our mind, as we've looked at this, we think that there's an opportunity, we believe that there's an opportunity to have a very positive impact throughout the community as a result of development on this site. And we'll talk about some ways that we believe that can be done. So once we came to understand sort of these three pillars, as I refer to it, transportation, the civic interest, and the community interest, then you begin to think about what should this site become? What are the opportunities? And that's what this graphic is trying to speak to. When you think about it in terms of mobility, some of the things that we've talked about and we've thought about are, how do you create a world-class transit hub here? Can you connect Metra, CTA, Amtrak, and an idea we refer to as the Shy Line, a commuter link that can knit together all these important institutions on the lakefront. How can you leverage key infrastructure, the busway? Probably the most underutilized piece of infrastructure, one of the most underutilized pieces of infrastructure in the city. We think there's an opportunity to create a circulator type system that can bridge this gap that exists along the lakefront between institutions that drive an incredible amount of visitation. From a civic standpoint, the opportunity to bring retail, dining, entertainment amenities to a location like this. When you study buildings like we're in, McCormick Place, oftentimes we use what's called a walkability score. What is the amenity set that's in a walkable footprint of a place like this, of a destination like this? And to compete worldwide, that factor, the amenity set, is becoming more and more important to the future of places like McCormick Place. Some of the other opportunities that we'll talk about, this idea of a gateway to the lakefront. Can we create something that really unifies the lakefront experience? On the community end, you'll see some illustrations where we believe we can create a significant amount of new open space, green space, a bridge to the lakefront, something that closes this gap in the heart of the city here and literally creates a physical linkage from the neighborhood through this site out to the lakefront. And so these graphics, I think, represent well some of the opportunity that we see. From a transit standpoint, in our studies, one of the opportunities that we see is to obviously maintain the Metro Electric and South Shore line through the site. That will not change. We've seen opportunity working with Metra, potentially to bring in the BNSF line that runs in from the west today on existing track to a transit hub that would be located at this location. We believe there's an opportunity to extend the Orange Line to that transit hub, again using the CN right-of-way, that transportation corridor, even potentially Amtrak, which runs by the site today. That's not additive. Those trains come by the site today. We believe there's an opportunity that too could be brought together in this transportation hub, and you would create maybe the only transportation hub in the country where you can truly unify local, regional, national rail, and then this idea of the Shy Line, this commuter link that would come from that transportation hub and circulate through the lakefront to each of the civic institutions and provide a very efficient means of moving people, not just going to the civic institutions, but as an example, all of you people that live in the neighborhood that want to go to the river, that would be a circulator-like system that would provide a very efficient means of moving through the neighborhood up to the park and beyond. So transportation is significant. We just don't have this type of transportation infrastructure, certainly here in Chicago, and it really doesn't exist throughout the U.S. Where this has been done, it's been done, in, generally speaking, in other parts of the world. Civic places, we talked about this idea of creating a network, a system that allows for better movement of people, to the lakefront and within the lakefront, and creating an amenity set that is supportive of the civic institution. And then within the community, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, as time goes on. We see many ways that, and you'll see some good examples of this, that a development like this can not only bring what we think of as improvements to the neighborhood. I'm sure that not everyone will agree that some of the ideas are necessarily improvements, but we also see opportunities to address problems within the neighborhood, traffic and things like that. So what do we imagine here? We'll jump to the graphics here in a minute, but what we imagine here is a development of significance that can be built above this transportation hub that creates this point of presence on the lakefront that is a mixed-use development by nature. And when I say mixed use in this case, I think of it as mixed use in terms of the next generation. Generally, when we talk about mixed-use development that's been done in this country, it's been residential with office and some retail. We see opportunities beyond that here. Education, learning, we think has the opportunity to have a major presence here. Primary on up to higher education. Health and wellness. I've done a lot of healthcare development. Destination healthcare is kind of an evolving strategy among major healthcare providers. We think that can have a major presence here. And then other opportunities. Of course, it will have residential, we imagine, commercial, retail, dining, entertainment, and hospitality. So we envision it to be mixed use in sort of the broadest sense of that term. And these images just give you a sense of that. As you look at this site plan, this is one of probably 100 diagrams like this that we've drawn just to begin to start to think about what could you begin to position on this site. And what I think is important with this plan is first to understand what would it take to create a development footprint here. You don't see any tracks on this image, as an example. So in order for the site to become buildable, several things have to happen. Number one, if you look at the site in its current condition, again, we're back to this three-dimensional graphic shot from the southeast. That red boundary, again, is the boundary of the site. The first thing that we have to do is to reposition the Metro tracks. This is something we've been working with Metro on now for some time. And the basic idea is to run the track in a more long and straight configuration rather than that massive width where the Weldon Yard operation sits today. And in doing so, then we would begin to build a structural cap over those tracks, really over the entire site, which is what this diagram represents. Really no different than how McCormick Place was built, right? McCormick Place built a structure, a platform, over the tracks, and then a convention center was built above that. So very much in that same format, we envisioned that is how the site would begin to be developed. So if you can imagine, this is grade here. The tracks would remain at grade. And this structure, I'll show you a section in a minute that'll explain this, I think, a little bit better. But the tracks remain at grade. All the transportation infrastructure would be located down below this platform. And this is what we think of as the transportation hub, I call it, for lack of a better description. So beneath this is all of that transit infrastructure that comes together in a single station. If you think of a modern, what would a transit station look like in the future? It's thought to be something that unifies all these different elements of transit in a single station. As you come up from grade, go back through it. As you come up from grade, there would be a level of structured parking, a second level of structured parking, which is where that transportation hub would occur, and then new grade, if you will. I apologize, this is not the easiest thing in the world to explain, but new grade, if you will, would occur about 50 feet in the air. No different than McCormick Place where the event level is. So the idea is to basically build structure above the track and to establish grade at that roughly 50-foot elevation. Then the development, the commercial development, if you would, will exist above that. So what's being represented here is these low-rise buildings. We envision that to be retail, dining, entertainment. So we'll use this diagram now to address a number of issues that we've been working on and thinking about to come to a point where we can have a meeting like this and begin to talk about issues, ideas, concerns, etc. And we'll go through maybe half a dozen or more of these graphics. The first one is really intended to give you a sense of what would this transportation hub, what would it look like, how would it operate? And so all these lines just simply represent where these different rail lines would come from. They all exist today. There's no new rail here. It's creating an intersection among all the existing rail agencies in the city, including the blue line here represents the idea of the Shy Line circulating through the museum campus up through the park on the busway as far as Native Pier. The red circle is really intended to be where that transit hub would be located. This diagram is intended to give you a sense of what we believe can be accomplished in terms of creating a new open space, green space, and this idea of a bridge through the park, across the development, and then out into the park. We envision a literal bridge, a pedestrian pathway from Indiana through the site out to the park. And then obviously working north and south, creating a plaza-like open green space that would be open to the public and would have an urban context and urban scale to it. One of the questions that I've had at times is, from the neighborhood side of the development, how would you approach the development? And so some of the work that we've done, some of the ideas that we've had are, we see a series of opportunities at 18th through the park to the north, where on existing right-of-ways, roads, there would be pathways that would come to the development, and then we would have a means, in the case of this location and to the north, we would have a means to come in and up to the development. In the case of the park, you come in a grade transition. You wouldn't come up structure, you come in a rolling grade transition, much like the park today, the grade transition as you come to the east. One of the important issues that we've been working on, we've started a traffic study. Obviously, in any neighborhood where you see the draw of visitation you have on the lakefront here, you've got massive traffic issues. You don't need me to explain that to you. A couple of points that I want to be very clear on, as we've been working with Alderman Dowell and others. I know at times in the past there was discussion about ingress and egress from the west, from the neighborhood. That is not our intent, that is not our plan. The ingress and egress to the site would occur from Lakeshore Drive. What we estimate is roughly 65% of the traffic that comes to the site would come via 18th Street. The balance of the traffic would come 35% roughly. These aren't final numbers by any stretch, but roughly 35% of the traffic we envision would enter and exit at McFetridge. Lakeshore Drive has a certain capacity there. Any dense urban development has to have access by way of road. We did look at ideas about ingress and egress from the west, and for a whole host of reasons I don't imagine too many people in the room would disagree with. The conclusion that we've come to thus far is the best way to serve the site from a traffic standpoint would be strictly from Lakeshore Drive at these 2 points of ingress and egress. This graphic picks up on the idea of traffic in some of the analysis that we've done, what data is showing us is that you have a very high reliance on automobile movement into, through, and around the neighborhood. Again, driven largely by the fact that you've got major civic institutions that bring millions of people to the lakefront on an annual basis. The estimates right now are as high as 90% come by way of vehicle, 10% by way of transit. That would be very high in our experience in a dense urban area like this. What you hope to do with this kind of, what you do with this kind of transportation hub is to shift mobility, to move the reliance in moving people from single occupant and multi-occupant vehicles to using transit. And so some of the targets that you would aim for in a situation like this would be to shift from a 90-10 to a 30-70 mobility mix with the type of transit that we think can come together in this transit hub. Density program, these are not intended to be buildings. Thought that might be the reaction that we got with this slide. What we're trying to do here is begin to identify through massing models what type of density is appropriate on a site like this. I could have shown this to you with 6-story buildings on it. That would not, in our mind, be consistent with what the opportunity is for this site. And it frankly wouldn't be consistent with much of the development, not all the development, but much of the development that's occurred in the neighborhood. And so this is a study. And I think part of what's important with this study is to understand this graphic. What this graphic represents is how we've begun to look at density view corridors and an idea about, I'll use the term porosity, but how to build a dense urban development, but to do it in a way that does not have the kind of urban density that you see elsewhere in the city, where buildings are literally living side by side. One of the things that we'd like to explore here is the blue arrows represent view corridor easements that we intend to respect. Those are existing view corridor easements that are surveyed, they are recorded, and so one of the things that we identified early on is just that these view corridor easements exist. That's an uncommon situation elsewhere in the city, and so we've identified those, and one of the things that we need to begin to think about is where can buildings be located while respecting those view corridor easements. Along with that, the yellow shading that you see is really intended to begin to measure and think about this idea of porosity. How can buildings be placed so that you can maintain views, sunlight, etc., through the development? One strategy would be you just bookend these buildings and you create almost a literal wall of architecture like other dense areas within the city. That, in our mind, would not be the most appropriate way to think about this type of density, this type of development. This point is something that we've taken from some of the studies that we've been looking at. People ask all the time about property values. What drives property values in urban settings? There's lots of data, lots of analysis that's been done that shows property value, particularly residential property value, in urban settings in a walkable footprint to this type of transit hub drives increased property values. In addition to that, the Parks District has put out a study that says walkability into the park enhances property values. So these are some of the types of things that we want to study as we begin to look at how do we create these linkages from neighborhood through this site into the park.
Such bullshit.
FAR, this is the ultimate measure of density. One of the studies that we've been working on is to look at what is the FAR condition that exists elsewhere throughout the city where you have large-scale, dense urban development. These numbers they vary pretty significantly. Where we've sort of been gauging this is trying to test ideas that are more in the midpoint of density when you compare this to other urban sites throughout the city. So these last couple of slides we'll share with you. These are rendered images. Again, these are ideas. We're trying to capture a sense of what the opportunities might be. There is no architecture at this point. There is no firm plan. I can say we have a lot of ideas and we've learned a lot about the site. We want to start a process now to begin to engage with the community and begin to think through what is the opportunity here and how best to put together a plan that respects a broad set of interests. Much like there are neighborhood interests, I've heard a lot of interest and ideas and thoughts from the civic institutions and from the community beyond just this immediate area. So we want to work through a process to learn and gain that input, and from that we'll begin to build a plan that hopefully we can find common ground and things that will be additive more than they are, in your minds, taking away from the neighborhood. And so these are some ideas. This gives you a sense of what that retail, dining, entertainment, what that public space might begin to look and feel like. Again, there's the architecture is not significant here, but the thinking is some level of density and then an environment that defines itself by the things that Chicago is noted for: the lakefront, civic institutions, neighborhoods, great architecture. So again, you'll see a series of ideas here that we've begun to develop, and there will be many, many more of these developed over time. This image is sort of taken out as if you were hovering almost up over Lakeshore Drive, looking back to the north. The idea of density, the glass building is an idea about the transit hub, what that structure might begin to look and feel like. Soldier Field, obviously, to the right. And then this idea of a pedestrian bridge that would come from the neighborhood across the site and then bridge out into the park. This image is to sort of begin to gauge and think about an idea of how you bring the transit together. So looking from the bottom of the page up, you begin to understand how the transportation infrastructure could exist at grade where it is today, how that platform, much like McCormick Place, would be built above it. So we're taking what is today an open rail yard and basically enclosing that. And as you then come up to the top of that platform where you see all that green movement, the idea would be that we create a pedestrian space, a green space that carries from the neighborhood through the development, literally through the building, on out into the park and down to the lakefront. And then with that, above that transit hub, we imagine, an environment that creates retail, dining, entertainment, amenities that are important to the development, the surrounding civic institutions, and I believe in time will become important amenities to the neighborhood. This image is, again, just trying to frame ideas about how this site, with development, could begin to fill this hole that exists between downtown, the lakefront, the neighborhood, McCormick Place, and beyond. Again, there's no thinking that's gone into architecture here. There's no definition of building heights. We're trying to, I think, show with this image this idea of porosity, right? How we're trying not to create a literal wall of development that runs continuous along Lakeshore Drive, how we can create openings between those buildings. As development comes online over time, this is a development that's, 15 plus years. This is not something that happens overnight, much like Central Station as you know it to date. This is not a development that came together in 3 years or 5 years. These things mature over an extended period of time. So these are, as I said, these are a set of images, ideas. We just have not moved to a point where we can start to talk in a more definitive way about architecture, density, building height, etc. That will start to evolve now as we begin to engage with the community and others. So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. I appreciate the time and the consideration of the ideas that we've had. Happy to open it up and answer questions.
Thank you, Dunn. So this is how we're going to handle questions. There are 2 mics, one here and one on the other end. If you have a question, please go to the mic.
Okay. I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
And we're going to start with the mic on the left and then go to the mic on the right. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a question. For those of us that have a north-facing city view, do you have a picture of how those tall buildings will, what the view corridor will be looking north? I mean, I know it's important east because you have the lake, but a lot of us have really nice city views. So I'm just wondering how those buildings are going to block our north city view.
We do have an image that will help answer that question. Keep in mind the site is long and narrow, and I don't know exactly where your reference point is, but
I'm in 1801, the second group arrow.
right. So to the north, these buildings sit as they're shown here. These buildings sit, sort of facing on Lakeshore Drive, if you will, and extend back maybe 200 feet roughly, as they're shown in these massing studies. So from your building looking due north, your view really would not change, other than at maybe 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, you'll have a series of buildings that are on the horizon. But as a general statement, if you're looking due north toward the taller buildings in Central Station today, there would not be a new structure that would be standing in front of you. I should also mention, because I know there have been a number of questions, with the buildings up at the northern end of Central Station on Roosevelt and to the south, the tallest buildings are up in here. Our site today ends at McFetrich. So, those diagrams you saw, those massing studies represent buildings down through this zone. So if I'm here looking due north, my view really doesn't change. There might be some, you'd see a building off to your right somewhat, but if I'm up here, your view to the east and your view to the north would not change. Now, in fairness, if you go back, while we do not control this property here, personally, I would like to argue in time, it would be nice to see that developed out as park-like space connecting on up to Roosevelt.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, quick question. For a big project like this, you usually take 10 years or more to complete, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so during this 10 years, during the construction period, time is the most precious commodity of everyone sitting here. How will everyone sitting here be compensated for the traffic jam, the noise, and all the problems created during the next 10 years? How we will be compensated for that?
Well, good question. What I anticipate, based on the work that we've done thus far, is this podium, that structure, that would be built in its entirety in, let's call it, phase 1. From a construction, noise, access, traffic standpoint, you've lived with traffic in the neighborhood, construction traffic, for a long time, and it will continue, right, as the neighborhood continues to see development. In the case of this project, from a construction standpoint, all of that movement would come not from within the neighborhood, it would come from the east. So we'll protect the neighborhood against construction traffic, that you've grown accustomed to here in the neighborhood by serving it from the east. once we get the development, let's call it phase one, that structural frame built, and the amenities on top of it, what you've now gained are the amenities in the neighborhood, right? It'll include retail, dining, entertainment, the entire transit hub, and all of this green area that you see here, including the bridge to the lakefront. So the plan would be that that development is completed in phase one, which is probably a 3-year construction time frame. And then the vertical development, that would be a building like that, you know, just these buildings here. These buildings here are low-rise buildings. So you would have protection against the neighborhood once that phase one is completed, and no traffic coming from the east, as these taller buildings would be built on the eastern edge of the site. Again, all served from the eastern side of the development, not from within the neighborhood.
Thank you, sir. Yes?
What you have not addressed, and thank you, Alderman Dowell, for having this meeting for all of us. What you have not addressed at all is, my wife and I moved to 1515 South Prairie 15 years ago because of the neighborhood, the views of the lakefront, and everything you're talking about destroying. What are you going to do for the rest of us?
Well, again, fair question. You know, I respect your question, and as we tried to explain, and go back to that graphic that shows, there are three view quarter easements that were established back when those buildings were built. And it would be our intent to maintain and respect those view quarter easements. Those were established for a reason. Those were established to maintain and protect those view quarters to the east, specifically to address your question. Now, those view quarter easements were established anticipating that there would be development of some type. And I believe it was anticipating development similar to what we're talking about this evening, east of your property. And so the first answer to the question is, we will respect those view quarter easements, and we would also like to work on ways to position buildings with density that does not create this walled-off effect to the lake.
Thank you, sir. Over here.
Alderman Dowell, thank you again for conducting this session. I'm confident that through your leadership, the views of the community will be well represented. My concern is primarily traffic. We all know, living in this neighborhood, that Roosevelt Road essentially becomes a parking lot too many times a year, and it's hard to navigate through this neighborhood either on foot or in a car. We're on feet all the time, and the traffic is just too great, and more traffic on Michigan Avenue and Roosevelt Road. Going to the east will still be traffic issues for us in this neighborhood, no matter how many entry points you have off of Lakeshore Drive. My second concern is the height of these buildings. They are far, far, far too high. Finally, my question is about the mobile transit hub. To what degree has your organization worked with Amtrak? Because I'm having doubts that Amtrak would move any traffic here after spending over $1 billion in their hub in downtown Chicago. But to what degree have you worked with Amtrak, Metro, CTA, RTA to actually make what you're saying is your vision a reality? Thank you.
With respect to the rail agencies, we have ongoing discussions with RTA. We've probably spent the greatest amount of time with Metro. We were with the Metro board several weeks ago. We have talked through these issues and worked on engineering with Metro extensively, and we will continue to do that. I mean, there are many issues that have to be worked through with Metro. With respect to Amtrak and CTA, those improvements don't run through the site. We've had conversations with Amtrak. We've met with CTA. Those are really added developments because they don't impact the site in the same way as the Metro rail infrastructure. We honestly have not spent as much time with them. I think across the board, in all the work that we've done, we've seen a high degree of interest in looking for an opportunity to create this type of a rail infrastructure that has the potential to tie each of these different rail agencies together. You know, I'm not going to tell you that that's done and complete. It's a long way from that, but we've spent a good amount of time. We've done a good amount of engineering work. We've had a good amount of conversation, and my belief is that there's strong interest in seeing these ideas evolve and come together in some manner as I've described them to you this evening. Sure. With respect to traffic, you know, I'd give you a similar answer. We're working with our transportation engineers. We've done an extensive amount of work. We have measured traffic counts at key intersections. And we've identified, you know, I think many of the same challenges that you spoke to that don't necessarily have easy solutions. What I do know based on that work is the most impactful way to have a positive outcome with respect to traffic in the neighborhood is to create a new form of mobility centered within the neighborhood. You know, outside of that, I don't think you're going to see reductions in the number of people, visitors that come to the lakefront. And as that continues to evolve and visitation grows, absent another alternative, meaning transit, the impacts in the neighborhood are only going to intensify as you continue to develop within the neighborhood. That's going to add traffic counts. There's many examples throughout Chicago where transit is the most efficient means of reducing traffic. And so I would not suggest to you this evening that we have all of the answers on how mobility improvements through rail, exactly how they'll have an impact on, positive impact on the neighborhood, but it's certainly proven to be the best opportunity to improve transportation throughout the entire area.
All right, this gentleman right here.
Do you have any plans to work with like tech companies like they do in Toronto to maybe build like a smart neighborhood, something that like has low emissions, less traffic?
Absolutely. We haven't yet offered that plan, but all of these big projects today are beginning to look at technology, and this is emerging technology that can do things like lower use of utilities, improve transportation movement, improve safety and security in neighborhoods, evolve elements of sustainability. And so it is our belief that very soon, as we start to better understand what the scope, scale, size of this project might be, that smart city technology will be a very important part of how a project like this and how this project in particular should come together.
Yes, sir.
Would the Orange Line expansion require an elevated track? And can you, and so if you looked at the noise increase that would be, and today, can you give a promise to all of us that traffic will only come from the east, not from the west, and that you will guarantee that you will not see any grade reduction of roads west of the site?
Well, let me answer that one as best as I can. It has received a lot of attention, the idea of will there be road ingress and egress coming from the west. What I can tell you tonight is I see no way that that is going to occur into or out of the development, the only exception to that being emergency ingress and egress. Fire department will always require that they have access when possible from all sides of a site, particularly a site like this. That's a code-driven issue. So based on the work that we've done and all the studies that we've looked at, I just don't see any way that it would work to have traffic coming from the site going west or coming from the west into the site. I just don't see any other alternative there.
What about the orange line?
Hold on.
He asked the question about the orange line that hasn't been answered yet.
Excuse me, I'm handling this meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was going to answer that. as relates to the orange line, the studies that we've looked at and the engineering that's been done is looking at bringing an elevated line over, much like the orange line is elevated today. If there are opportunities possibly to bring that to grade, that's something that I've talked about, and our transportation engineers that are here in the room with me could attest to the fact that every time we talk about the orange line, I raise the question, is there any way that that could be done at grade? I've not heard an answer to that says it can be done at grade, but it is something that I would like to explore further, and I imagine you would as well. But the work that we've been doing thus far is that I've seen from an engineering standpoint suggests that would come over on elevated rail.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bob, could you go back to the slide that you had on the pedestrian access? I have a question about that. When I look at that preliminary drawing, am I looking at 18th Street, 14th Street, and 16th Street?
Yes.
Okay. And
Just to, if I can, 18th,
okay.
16th is, right in here. It's not perfectly right. The CN track comes through here, and 14th up here. Color timber.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm very concerned about my view as well. So I am on floor 9. And you were talking about how you're going to cover the train tracks with low rises. Will I be able to see that at all? So right now I'm looking directly at the lake.
Right. I don't know exactly what building you're in.
What address do you?
1629 South. Yes.
No, it's further up.
1629.
South 30th Street.
You're on-
Area.
Right there.
Right there.
So if you're on, let me address a couple of issues. The buildings to the south here, the parking bustle that you have with those buildings, that podium, generally speaking, around 5 stories. The height of those podiums is about equal to the height of the platform here, just to give you a reference point. Then you got residential above. So that's sort of what we're dealing with. As you come north, if you're in a building where residential's at ground level and you're on the 9th floor, this structure, this lower building, mid-rise structure that sits on the podium is probably 80 feet in the air. So depending on what elevation you're at, depends on whether your first floor of your building is at grade, at street level, or whether your building sits on top of one of these parking bustles. So I don't know that I can answer your question specifically, but that should give you some reference point. Okay, so the building that you're in sits, I don't think you can see it, it's right in here. So that building, you have a parking bustle in that building. So if you're on the 9th floor, you're roughly 100 feet above the podium.
Well, he did answer it. She's on the 9th floor.
Yes, yes. So these easements, those blue arrows, represent the north and south boundaries of those easements. So if you turn the camera on this drawing, so that you were directly dead, this is a good example, where you're dead on with the view corridor easement as it's recorded and filed. That's the point of these blue arrows, is to show how from the edge of the building to the edge of the building, that view corridor is maintained out to the lake. That was the purpose of those view corridor easements, was to protect that cavity of space, which is it's defined by a survey. Yes, you will. So you're here. You're here. That view corridor easement goes from the northern edge of your building to the southern edge of your building. And it comes through, as you can see in this diagram, it comes through here, and it comes through here. So those blue arrows, those represent these view corridor easements. Here, here, and here.
Okay, we'll go here. Sir?
Thank you, Alderman Dowell, for opening the floor. One of the big issues we already have is event parking. We have on the streets, which has always come up. And I appreciate the aggressive transportation plan. Can you tell us, dig in a little bit more, how the parking that you're going to make available does not add to the already crowded neighborhood parking?
Surely. You know, I've heard a lot about game day impacts. It's not just game day. I certainly understand that there's many other events in the area, in the park, in the neighborhood, where you have significant impacts within the neighborhood, not just traffic, but people moving and what have you. One of the opportunities that we believe can greatly improve those conditions, having done a lot of stadium work, we deal with these issues on a regular basis. What we see the opportunity to do first is to shift mobility, use transit to reduce the number of cars that come to the lakefront during peak event periods, games and other times. And we believe there's a significant mobility shift that will occur there that greatly reduces the number of cars that come to the lakefront. Point number one. Point number two, the traffic, the parking that we could provide here will access ingress and egress from Lakeshore Drive. Not from the neighborhood. In addition to that, what some of these diagrams have shown are those control points moving people to and from the neighborhood. In a game situation, in other areas like this, it wouldn't be uncommon to use control points like that to improve how a game day type situation, how that impacts the neighborhood. You know, you can go to extremes. You can literally restrict people from moving through the neighborhood. That's not a decision that we'll make. That's a decision that will be made, you know, among a group like this. So I think you have many opportunities to begin to explore different ways to deal with some of the more impactful conditions that you experience here in the neighborhood, particularly as it relates to some of these larger event type experiences that you see in and around the neighborhood.
This gentleman here.
Thank you, Alderman Dowell. I commend you for assembling this presentation first for the neighborhood, and then also, I'm with McHugh Construction, and we've been in this neighborhood, in the community here for over 50 years. And we have supported the South Loop Farmers Market, members of the Near South Planning Board, and we own several sites in this area. We recently invested $150 million across the street with the Hilton's at Corning Place, featuring our View Rooftop, Fat Four, and we're working hard to get another restaurant in Sumac in Indiana. We've also invested in our headquarters office here in the South Loop. So to say that we are invested long in this neighborhood would be a vast understatement. So the building, thank you. The building building open tracks is very visionary, and it looks like you're really developing an ultimate transit-oriented development, which is fantastic. I'm most impressed that you're making lakefront accessibility easier for us with public space. Views in Chicago are long on the record as not protected, and recognizing these view corridors is a great step forward. So you've made it very clear nothing is set. And at this very first look, we applaud your efforts and your vision and your willingness to be proactive and share your plan, and look forward to your working and engaging with our neighborhood groups to collaborate and develop a great plan. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Alderman Dowell and Mr. Dunn, for giving the community an opportunity to come and take a look at your vision. And I have to say that I haven't been more excited about the developer's vision for not just this community, but for the city of Chicago in this plan. And obviously, I'm not going to discount the fact that the pain, you know, when I know for many, many years being real estate, selling in every single one of these buildings that's going to be impacted with views, you know, obviously we're going to try to find the wins. We're going to try to be as respectful as possible with positioning of buildings and doing, but that aside, I want to acknowledge the pain here, because that's what you're hearing. But I want to put that aside for a second and talk about, get a little bit more into into the meat of what makes this development so incredibly exciting. So the idea that you could be a convention. Oh, I'm going to get to the question.
Okay. Can we get to a question?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay, can you get to two?
Yes. Okay, how long will it take to get on this people mover, the Shy Line, to get from McCormick Place to Navy Pier? If you get on.
And what's the second question?
The second question is, what volume of commercial space is going to sit on top of the deck, the first level of deck? So you didn't really go into the volume of the kind of destination that's going to exist in this project. And I have other questions as well, and I'll go to the back of the line and come back, but those are the two.
All right.
Yes, if you guys don't know, I'm Tina Beltside. I'm the president of the Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance. I've been an advocate for our community for over 12 years. I live in the South Loop, and I am here for you, okay?
Thank you. Mr. Dunn?
On the question of the commute time to Navy Pier, if you've been on the CTA busway or the busway, it's minutes. During the worst traffic condition in the city, you're literally a few minutes away because there are no stops on the busway. So it's about as efficient a means of moving through the city when you have these peak conditions of extreme traffic and congestion. Beyond that, the retail program, if you will, could be very significant. The footprint of the site is very large. You've got 30 plus acres. You could have a dense retail dining and entertainment format of significance there. I couldn't give you an exact number, but it's hundreds of thousands of square feet of potential. And a diverse programmatic mix of different retail uses, things that are more sort of traditional neighborhood retail, dining and entertainment, more experiential retail, and what we think of as destination type retail that would be consistent with what you'd expect around a convention center and civic institutions like you have here.
Thank you.
I'll come back.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Alderman Dowell.
How are you?
Good. Thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to see visually the preliminary planning. My questions are, I came in and I apologize if you already went over this, but for the 18th, 16th, and 14th Street entryways, are you elevating those roadways? And if so, where do they begin to elevate and come over? How does that work?
The roads would not go back. Those blue arrows are not roads. Those are just intended to indicate the rights of way that exist around those streets. And at the street end, we would imagine that you would have a means of, right, there's an elevation difference, so we imagine that you'd have a way of moving by stair from street level. The streets themselves would not change at all in elevation, what have you.
Okay, so it's a similar pedestrian elevated walkway that we have now, type
Right.
entryway.
Right.
So, my concern, and I'm sure there's no way to stop it, but living there and breathing the health hazard of the construction dust, especially if you're having to drive in pylons that have to go deep into the bedrock to support that heavy weight over top of the tracks, much like that was done at Wolf Point at the Tri-River area in River North. I know that that's a huge undertaking, and pounding is another noise construction that we're going to have to deal with, it seems, for quite a long time over this many years of span. There's no way to stop that. I want to make it clear that that's what we're facing. And to me, that's the risk, really. It's not so much the development, because it could help us in the end for values and whatnot, and green space, if you come together with what you're promising here. But it's the noise and the health hazards of the dust. We like to open our windows. We live right there, most of us in this room. And it's not healthy.
Thank you. Who's going to answer your questions? I'm going to have to stop you at 2, ma'am, because the lines are long. You can come back through if you would like. Bob?
can't deny in an urban setting that construction does have impacts. That's unavoidable. I think it happens all over the city. What I would, I guess, speak to though in that respect is you do have an active rail yard there now. There's a certain amount of noise and disruption that comes with that. That will be, that element will be, brought indoors, so to speak, covered. After the podium, after this structure gets built, the taller structures, the vertical buildings, will be built on the eastern edge of the development, so they're not backed up to the neighborhood. Further away than a lot of the buildings that have gone up and then had a neighbor built next to them. But I can't deny that there's going to be an active construction zone here for over a period of time. I think where usually we hear the most complaint about construction, frankly, is related to traffic. And so we want to solve that by not bringing traffic through the neighborhood. The only other point I would make, it was raised in a meeting I had some time ago with someone that had a neighborhood perspective, and the question was, there's a certain amount of traffic noise that comes from Lakeshore Drive today into the neighborhood, and will this structure help to mitigate some of that noise? I believe that it would.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Let me just say to the lady that just spoke, there are also various ordinances that the city has, noise ordinances, ways that they should behave as they go through construction, and those would apply here. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the pedestrian access plan that you have. If you could go back to that slide. Can you clarify what you're planning to do with that Mark Twain Park area?
Sure. Go back. So the idea, as an idea, I can't say we have a design, but the idea would be to create to improve the park, to create a pedestrian pathway while maintaining the park features, right? Dogs and kids and the things that are very active in the park today. And to bring that, in through the park and then up on into the development and continue that green space throughout the development. The design, the literal design of the park, is something that we would expect to work through in detail with those of you in the neighborhood. Someone made mention the other day, and I'm not saying this is the right analogy, but referred to that as a smaller version of the Maggie Daley Park. Whether that's the right analogy or not, I'm not going to say it is or it isn't, but basically our thinking has been to create an enhancement and a feature element for the entire neighborhood that becomes the pedestrian pathway through that area today and then on up into the development.
So the park stays, but you're going to increase, there'll be an increase in foot traffic.
I would expect there would be an increase in foot traffic.
And the only concern I have with that is that generally that area is a really quiet area, and a lot of families with young kids live there, and we all come together in that quiet park area pretty much every night, every evening from April to November. And it's one of the selling points of young families to be able to live in an area like this. And so I would be concerned with increased foot traffic and, teenagers walking through all times of the day. So that is something that I think should be considered in an area like this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say, we welcome your thoughts and ideas on how to create a park setting that, families feel even stronger about than what's there today. Any park is an asset for a neighborhood, and we'd like to find ways to make it more of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for listening. Actually, my comment builds on a comment of the previous person, in the sense that this neighborhood right now is a very intimate and family-oriented place where there's not much traffic, and a lot of us got into this neighborhood because of that. And let's be clear. I understand you have to turn up the profit, and let's be clear about it. This is what it is. It's not for the benefit of us, it's for the profit for the company. And sir, have you ever walked through the neighborhood? Through the historic
neighborhood, through the little historical park. And you can clearly see on this graph that most of the buildings in this area are townhouses or like mid-high rises at best. We live on the 22nd floor and we are on the top of the world right now. What you're proposing, and I understand you don't have the particular height, but from my estimation, you are planning the highest structure to be somewhere around 90 floors. So this would literally obstruct the sunrise for the whole neighborhood. And the other thing, those view corridors that you presented there, sir, you are legally obliged to use those. You cannot build over them. So this is not for our benefit. And also, have you ever considered that with such an increased amount of people who you would imagine moving in or through this community, that what about the security?
Thank you. Let him answer your question.
The intent of this slide that shows the view corridor easements is to identify where those exist and how they were basically legally established.
Exactly.
What those view corridors establish, though, is there's a certain elevation over which those views are protected.
Yes, I actually read the legal documents, and I understand that those legal documents were drafted in like 2004 or 2005, where this neighborhood, as it is, was pretty much non-existent. So,
Yeah, those easements, right, those are legally, you're absolutely right, those are legally defined, recorded easements that basically set an elevation. So these buildings that you see back here, those buildings are set, the height of those buildings are set in this diagram at the underside of those view corridor easements. Those easements set an elevation. It's not zero, it's not earth. They set a height over which those view corridors from west to east are protected. And we fully intend to maintain and respect those view corridors.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for hosting this meeting. I really like this proposal. I think it'll be a great asset for the city. Just one question about the proposed CTA station. I realize that this is all preliminary. So you mentioned potentially having the Orange Line come in and stop at the development. Would this be a terminal station for the Orange Line? And has there been any consideration towards routing the brown, pink, green, or purple lines to the development as well?
There have been discussions about some of the other CTA lines that possibly could come into a station like this. It's a little more complicated given their distance and what have you. There's also been discussion that potentially could the Orange Line extend further south? And this not be just a spur, but could it extend south and in some manner move back and continue back up to the site and out? So nowhere near decisions on those issues. A lot more work has to be done before those kinds of things can be defined.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, just to play off what the previous gentleman was saying, I think this project does have a lot of potential, and I would ask you, the developer, because I read this when this was kind of first announced about a week or two ago, that you're planning not on using TIF money for like the infrastructure and building over the tracks. Is that something that I read? Can you confirm that? Because there's been kind of a lot of upheaval in the city lately just because of the 78 and Lincoln Yards using TIF funds. And can you kind of talk about that for a moment? Then I have a comment.
Sure. It is not our intent, and it has not been our intent to use TIF. There's a lot of discussion that will come with that in time, but no, it is not our intent to use TIF to support the infrastructure of the project.
As someone who loves architecture and has been following this entire project in Central Station for almost 20 years, I hope that you pick multiple architects to design these buildings, because I think that's one of the problems with Central Stations, the same architect design so many of the buildings that the neighborhood is kind of visually boring. I know that a lot of you all in this room who live in the neighborhood are complaining about the traffic and the height of the buildings and the view corridors, but how come, as someone who doesn't really live in the neighborhood, how come I know about the tall buildings and density on this side more than you all do? How come I've known about this for 15 years and you all don't?
Okay, no scolding, no scolding. No scolding. So, your question was, what's the question?
I asked a question, that was a comment.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes. Multiple architects, that was the question.
Right, without question, the intent would be, over time, that you have, a series of different architectural interests that would be involved in designing the taller buildings on the site. Having said that, one of the things that we will establish early on in a project like this would be a set of design guidelines that would begin to set parameters around style of architecture, all the obvious things, density and what have you that come with zoning, but really the quality and the character of the architecture. We will want to establish that early on in our design guidelines, over and above the zoning that we deal with, that will then begin to govern the style of architecture, the architects, the designers that are involved.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could get to the pedestrian map again. Okay, I'm a resident of 2001 South Calumet, so I am smack dab at your southernmost point. Actually, my unit is facing your development.
Okay.
So my concern is, how are you going to make that pedestrian pathway, and how are you going to make it so that we're not looking at a platform?
Sure. One of the issues that we've spent some time talking about, and I wouldn't try and answer for you right now, is as you see here, there's a structure that's built that fronts on Lakeshore Drive. Obviously, on the back side of that structure, you've got that wall condition that will have to be dealt with. We recognize, that fronts back on the neighborhood, much like the buildings that you see here have that parking bustle. Those can tend to be fairly basic structures. So one of the things that we'd like to explore is, could we use things like art and other things to create a more sort of neighborhood-oriented presence of that structure as it's seen from the neighborhood. As you then get up to where you've got real estate built, those mid-rise, those low-rise buildings, those will have an architecture that come with them. All the kinds of issues that we would expect to work on with the neighborhood and the community before any final design is done.
The metro tracks are right there as well, so I'm just trying to envision how you're going to build over that, because our unit right now looks directly, we're eye level with those tracks. So again, we're concerned over our view. We're going to have a wall smack in front of us.
Are you?
We're 2001 South Calumet.
So you're.
I'm on that building, to the very south. It wasn't even highlighted in red on your site map. So if you pull up the site map, it's that, see the very high rise right there? That's our, no, actually, it's basically it's to the north of where McCormick lives.
Right here?
No, it's right there, right there.
Yeah, so you're.
There's a 7-story block building here.
Right, you know the condition of the backside of the apartment place, and it sort of returns to the east here.
So we're not looking at anything right now.
Right, you're looking out at I think, at the CN line, probably.
And if you build
And down onto the metro lines.
And if you build level with that platform, we will be looking at scaffolding. And that's my concern.
Understood.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Dowell, for setting this up, and thank you, sir, for coming to speak with us. I have 2 questions. Obviously, you're going to move forward with this plan. You're investing in it. I am near 14 and Prairie, and so I'm just trying to get a better sense of, and maybe to help you guys have probably already thought about this, there's a lot of elevation change there. As you go from 14th Street up to Roosevelt, Columbus is ramping to merge with Lakeshore, and so there's this big thing on one side, and then you have the Museum Park buildings basically at another level. There's a huge difference in elevation there. So some of the drawings look beautiful like this with a park extending all the way to Roosevelt, and you said that there's no commitment there between 14 and Roosevelt to build that. I'm curious, basically everything I'm asking is related to, should there be an obligation for you to help us with that park? If so, or even if you don't have that obligation, how do you envision what you building south of there merging with something north of there when 14th basically runs into the McCormick busway line? I don't know what it's called, but there's a street that runs along it. What are you seeing happening at that corner, since that's basically right near the pedestrian area, yet you have all these changes in elevation? That's question number one, the long question. The second one is the CTA is going to come in to the neighborhood. I think a lot of people have chosen to live east because it's far from the CTA. Yeah. That tends to be the loud part of the South Loop. And the Metro line and Amtrak run very infrequently now. And so even if we live near them, people that are intolerant of those sort of things can bear the low frequency with which they come by. I don't actually probably live near where that orange line would be coming in, but I would just wonder, do you have a plan to enclose that if it's going to remain elevated? Because I think it will upset a lot of people in the neighborhood to have it elevated and exposed.
Let me take the last question first. You know, as it relates to that extension coming in, a lot more work has to be done before we can answer those kinds of questions. Certainly understand rail and elevated rail. There is noise that comes with that. I mean, anybody in Chicago knows the impact of CTA that moves all through the city. As it relates to your question on elevation, that area that you're describing is probably the area where there's the greatest amount of geometry across the site. And I won't try and explain it standing here, other than to say where you're referring to is basically right in this area where McFetrich comes over. And so what we have to do is transition down from that podium to meet the street elevation as it comes in. And as you know, this area, you're right, it does grade up. And that's basically like the entire site today. You've got a retaining wall that increases in elevation. And in our mind, we would like to work with the community to explore, you know, is there an idea about extending that park to the north? I mean, it seems like a natural.
It could be so beautiful. It has to be thought through very well, because how would you bring it down to 14th and yet stay above the train tracks?
Right.
There's literally 14th Street running into McCormick Busway, and
right. To be clear, this would not the development would not transition down to 14th. It would transition down to an elevation that matches up with McFetrich, which would turn into the development. So there's a grade differential there between, let's call it grade at 14th, call that 0, and where McFetrich would come in and circulate into the site. It would be above that 14th Street elevation. But what we would
over to 14 to some level.
I'm sorry?
The podium you described does go to 14 to a certain elevation that's about the level of McFetrich.
It would match up to McFetrich. So it comes down from the podium height to McFetrich. And I guess what you would like to think about is there a way that can come down and meet McFetrich and then come up and basically fill that void where the Metro tracks are today?
I think it would be nicer for your neighborhood. It's sort of an obligation I think you should have to the current residents to think through that. There are townhomes, right? I don't live in one of those townhomes, but there are townhomes right there on 14th. So what happens to them, all this transition? It's an important spot.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, sir. That's an example of a very constructive suggestion. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for having the forum. I live 1600 South Prairie. Mr. Dunn, thank you for your time.
Excuse me, could you repeat your address?
1600 South Prairie, the townhomes there. A couple very brief comments to lead to my question. One, you mentioned there's a hole there where you're going to cap it. And I kind of see that as a comment of a solution without a problem. So I don't know if many residents here feel that the tracks there are a problem, that they're not covered. And so you're saying that this development is very early in the process, but to us it looks actually like you have quite a large master plan here that has quite a bit of momentum. And so that may not be your intention, but it just feels that way to some of us, that this is a large master plan with a lot of momentum behind it that is already moving full steam ahead. I understand that you're open to changes, and so I take your word. My question, in terms of space? And have you thought about affordability? Because like I was saying, a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, the problem that does exist in our city is affordability. And I know one problem we don't have is lack of luxury condos. So I see in terms of profitability, my concern is that for profitability, you're going to be building a lot of luxury condos. You mentioned healthcare, destination healthcare, all words that to me kind of reflect a lot of wealth. And I don't see a problem of a lack of space for wealthy people in our city. So this is concerning to me because, again, this is a solution for your developers without really a problem that anyone in the neighborhood really sees. We don't need this. So I don't need to implement it, but I just need to discuss in terms of the question regarding mixed-use residential areas in our city. And does this really fill that gap? I don't see it, but maybe I just don't know your full plan yet. So that's my question.
Good question. At this point, we don't have a residential mix that's been established, but certainly expect that residential will be a significant part of any plan like this. From the standpoint of affordability, very important issue. Again, one of the issues that we want to work with the community to embed and make a part of the overall plan in terms of how this development unfolds and moves forward. So respect the issue and understand the importance of the issue. And as this plan begins to evolve and move forward, we'll put definition around that.
So does that mean there's going to be affordable housing?
Let me just answer that. If this requires a amendment or PD approval, there is the city has an affordability requirement. And so those kind of discussions, when and if we get to that point, we will definitely come back to the community and present the unit count, the mix of unit prices and things like that. Right now, that affordability number is 10% of the total number of housing units.
On site?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you live in the South Loop?
Why not?
Okay, I do. This is my neighborhood. I love this neighborhood. I have a lot of money invested in this neighborhood. And you only care about your corporation and making money for your corporation. You do not have our best interest at heart. I want it on record that I think that this plan is an abomination. I think this would be terrible for my neighborhood. I just want it on record.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
You have stated that your intent is to not have access vehicular from the west, ingress or egress. However, you did state that the fire department needs access. You must have done a study on that. Where is that access for the fire department? And if it is such a large community, 34 acres, pardon me, sir, why don't you put a firehouse there so you don't need access?
I'm not going to try and speak on behalf of the fire department specifically on where they would want to locate, a firehouse, but to approach from the west for ingress, egress, for emergency purposes, there's different things that we've talked about. We haven't had meetings with the fire department to solve that, other than to say we know that the fire department will look for access from different directions. So McFetridge is one area where we see a grade transition that can come in and provide access up to the podium. It's possible you could think about a way to have pavement where emergency egress could come in through the park. As you get north and south, there's a grade transition that would not create an effective means of trying to transition up for emergency purposes. So there are ways to get there. That's a study, and there's engineering that will have to occur with the fire department before we'll have a final answer to that. But we do know that those are the kinds of issues that for emergency ingress and egress reasons, we know we'll have to address.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I live in a building that I can no longer see with the map. Two questions.
What is your address, ma'am?
1629 South Prairie. So two questions. One is, will the rest of the city get sunlight? And the second part of the question is,
how does these very densely planned align with the rest of the lakefront parks that are to the north? Like we have Grand Park, we have the rest of the park, Millennium Park. How does these plans align with that vision?
I'll answer that as best as I can. The idea is to create pedestrian pathways from the development, which means coming in from the neighborhood, but from the development with grade transitions, where a person can ride a bike, for instance, and not have to, come down stair and that type of structure. To be able to come from the development into the park. That can occur to the north, that can occur directly east, coming out of the development down into the park, even potentially down at the southern end of the development. So the idea has been to find ways to create grade transition that are ADA compliant and what have you, that will allow for movement of pedestrians.
Sun question,
I'm sorry?
the sun. Will the rest of the city get any sunlight?
I certainly expect so, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Alderman Dowell, for having this forum. If we could go back to the site plan for a second. Okay. I am at 1515 South Prairie. As I look at that site plan, I see that little square, I assume it's a building. I'm wondering what those little oval-shaped things off of it are, and how that whole little design, that over here, yeah, right there. What those little oval things around that building are, and how that whole thing relates to the view corridors. And you keep mentioning mid-rise and high-rise. Surely you have some idea of what you mean by mid-rise in terms of stories.
Sure.
As well as the whole elevation. I mean, in terms of stories, how high would that elevation for the transit corridor be?
Okay, let me try and answer those in what I heard a series of questions. If we said that the green is across the development here, is 50 feet roughly above the existing grade, to the top of that podium.
What, 50 feet? To me, this could be 50 feet to me.
Sure.
In terms of stories.
So let me give you a reference point again. These buildings here, they have a parking bustle at the base of those buildings, and then the residential is above that. That elevation of this structure would more or less match up with those parking bustles.
What are those buildings then?
For these buildings here,
What are those?
residential.
They're existing.
I know, but what's,
1901 and 1841.
So you've got a similar condition that basically, like I said, matches the parking bustle in those buildings in terms of the height and elevation of the structure here. It then grades down through the park to Indiana, and it would grade down to meet the elevation of McFetridge where it comes into the site. The structures, as they're shown on this plan, and this will evolve many times, the structures as they're shown on this plan, these buildings through here, through here, up into here, these would be buildings, and in here, through here, those would be buildings of 2 to 3 stories, generally speaking. The taller buildings, without trying to define how tall is tall, would be here, this building, and these 3 buildings. These buildings will move, considerably. There's no defined footprint for those buildings. This is one of many site plans we could define, but the idea was the taller buildings would happen on the eastern side of the site, and to try and create an amount of space between those buildings, so you've got this idea of porosity through the development. How tall these buildings are, we don't know at this point. I showed you what I thought was a diagram to give all of us a sense of building mass and density, and begin a discussion about the idea of height in lieu of width of buildings, to try and capture density that way. But we have a long way to go before we'll know exactly where are the buildings located, how tall the buildings are, how wide the buildings are, etc.
Okay, so the other part of my question, the first tall building that you identified, which is right in front of 1515 South Prairie.
No.
Come this way.
10-story structure. All of these mid-rise buildings that are on the western portion of the site are all designed basically to stay below the view corridor easements where those view corridor easements exist.
How high are the view corridor easements? When you mentioned there was a height required for the view corridor.
109 feet.
Right. So from 109 feet up from,
So the rest of us that don't understand, what does that mean in terms of stories?
109 feet, 110 feet is, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories, depending on whether it's retail, whether it's a residential floor is not as tall as a retail floor. So we have to be careful when you say floors. Different program uses have different elevations. So,
But that's on top of the house tracks, correct?
I'm sorry?
That's built on top of the track.
It's built on top of the trash, you say?
Yeah.
That's right.
And then you're going that high, and then you start what you're talking
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand.
Wait till your question. Stay in line there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate that you have to do the studies, et cetera, but we're almost an hour and 45 minutes into this, and, 5 blocks away, at a 6 to 10-minute walk, is another mega development being proposed, 78. And I haven't heard mention of that, and I guess my question to you is, have you done your massing studies in conjunction with what's being proposed on the 78? Have your traffic studies been done in conjunction with the traffic studies that are being done on the 78? Have you analyzed traffic of both developments on Roosevelt Road, on 18th Street, on Circle, etc.? I mean, as most people said, we moved to the South Loop not to be in Streeterville. And we're, yes, so my question is, have you done your massing studies in traffic and other studies looking at it in view of, in conjunction with the 78?
The best way I can answer that question is the firm that is working with us on all of our transportation studies is also working on the 78 development. So I think they have a good knowledge of the conditions there relative to the conditions that we're studying for this site.
And how about massing? I mean, it seems to me that putting all your very heavy massing right at 16th Street is right opposite the very heavy massing of 78 also, and it's just going to create, this high-rise corridor that's really what we don't see.
Yeah, I can't say from a massing standpoint that, that we have that same relationship between this development and that development in terms of the working team. I think it's fair to say that our master plan team has a good understanding of the plan for development there. Again, I would just say, at this point, these represent ideas. They don't represent a final design. Over time, you'll see many iterations of this plan and those massing studies and what have you. So I think they're quite a bit further along with their plan. We wanted to come to the community at an early stage, start a discussion knowing that these are the kinds of issues that we're going to have to work on. I respect all the questions and comments that I've heard here tonight. I can't say that any of them are surprising necessarily. What I can say is we wanted to come to the community, to the neighborhood, before we got to a point of firm plans, engineered drawings, an entitlement package that we want to take to the city. We want to approach this differently. And so you're seeing our work in the manner that it's been developed today.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to confirm, there will be no building north of 14th Street, is that correct?
There will be no building north of that point right there, which is 14.
Okay, so
We don't control the land up here. What there will be, just to be clear, I think what you're asking is building, vertical type building.
Yes.
There will be structure built from the edge of that building to allow for a grade transition to meet McFadden. So there will be structure built over track up to about that point, which is the end of our property. And
structure, what do you mean?
Uh,
Just bridges, retail?
No, the plaza, what you see there, green space, park-like space that will grade down to marry up with McFetridge.
And you own up to McFetridge, you said?
Yeah, the transition point is right about in here.
So from McFetridge to Roosevelt, who owns that?
That is controlled by the city.
And,
Well, let me be clear if I can. The earth, where the tracks sit, is land controlled by Metro.
well,
The city controls the air rights above that.
and the reason I ask is, you have it landscaped and, you know, from McFetridge to Roosevelt, who's going to pay for that? Who's going to do that? You or the city, or who's going to do that?
That's one of the issues, as I said, you know, in our mind, that would be a positive outcome from this development. So we'd like to work with the community and with the city to figure out, is there a way to create that linkage from the McFetridge interchange up to Roosevelt?
If you don't work it out with the city, from McFetridge to Roosevelt, will the tracks and the trains still be exposed, or is that going to be covered either way?
At this point, our viewpoint would be if we can't get that done together, that condition that exists there today would potentially not change.
It'd be the same as it is now.
Could be, yes.
Do you have a thought about that? I mean, are you suggesting that it should be covered? Are you saying that you would like to see a park? Or are you just asking a question?
Yes, absolutely, Alderman. I don't want to see buildings there. That's why my first question was, is it going to end at 14? But I think it'll be ridiculous to have this beautiful development to 14th Street, you know, and then have railroad tracks and, you know, this drop off from there to Roosevelt for 2 blocks. That makes absolutely no
I
sense.
couldn't agree more.
You know, but on the other hand, I don't want to see them buy those 2 blocks and put 2 more high rises.
There's no plan for that. Thank you.
And Bill, I want to just make one comment before you. You had said that when building is done, none of the traffic, the trucks and all that will come from the west. My understanding is you can't have trucks on Lake Shore. Right. So I don't know how you're going to ship all this material and Lake Shore Drive unless they change the law.
Yeah, one of,
I don't know how you do that.
Don is raising his hand right here.
I tried to move and drive a van on Lake Shore.
How you doing? I've worked in a development now. I'm sorry, I'm Don Grabowski. I'm part of the team that's doing this. I used to be the chief traffic engineer. I used to actually have to permit this. So I would expect CDOT to permit it just for construction, in fact, we have to permit our own trucks, well, not our anymore because I don't work there. We used to have to permit our own trucks to haul salt or sand or anything else that's required for the park district. So the trucks actually get permitted themselves. They're the only vehicles that then are allowed at Lake Shore Drive.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to address specifically the issues of senior citizens, which have not been addressed here at all. When we started, there were a whole lot of white heads. They've all, most of them have left already, but it's almost 8 o'clock. I have to be home. Okay, first of all, as senior citizens frequently, their largest single asset is their residence, you know, a condo, a house, whatever. That is my case. I live on South Prairie, 1335 South Prairie. My largest single asset is that condo. I've been told by many sources that if this development starts, which would eliminate about half of my lake view, you know, east and south, is gone. That the value of that condo will drop precipitously. We're also at a very weird time with property taxes, with the Trump tax plan, limiting in Illinois and other places, you know, other states, our ability to deduct more than $10,000 of property tax. I think about $15,000. So I'm going to be, you know, 5,000 in the hole starting next year. And I don't see that the city of Chicago is going to be very eager to allow people to lower their property
taxes, once your project takes away their view and reduces the value of their property, I think it's very difficult to get property tax lowered. So, I'll be paying out of pocket for something that you've taken away from me. And then it's also questionable, will I even be able to sell the unit? Also, I want to talk about the transportation, because you were pushing really, really hard on the mass transit and reducing vehicle traffic. Mass transit for senior citizens frequently involves walking up steps. If we're living in the South Loop, we're going somewhere else, okay? And it may not be 2 blocks from the train station, 5 blocks from the train station. Right now, I can, go down into my garage, into my building, get my car, go do grocery shopping, my Jewel, or, visit a friend or something. You can't expect me and other folks my age with arthritis, spinal stenosis, AFib, whatever, to be, riding divvy bikes or getting on mass transit, just so you can make a buck.
Can we respond to your question?
Yes, I would like to know how you have built the needs of senior citizens into this colossal ego project.
Well, the one fact that we will deal with in anything that we build is it will be absolutely ADA compliant. It sets a whole series of conditions on design and development that speak to issues that people with mobility, hampered mobility, have to deal with. One example, though, I would give you of an existing condition is the rail platform you have in the neighborhood today is nowhere near ADA compliant as one existing condition. And so with the transportation hub, that will be designed to address issues like that.
So you're expecting I should go to the transportation hub, take the mass transit to a Jewel, buy my groceries,
Why can't you just
and
drive
bring
your
it
car?
back on the train?
Actually, no, I would say my thought would be you come to the development to buy your groceries and save the trouble of getting on a train or getting in your car to have to transport back and forth the time and the effort that it would take to get groceries. So.
All right, thank you. And Alderman Dowell, thank you for this.
You're welcome, Leon.
One comment that Alderman Dowell wanted me to mention is that where you're at, your view would not be obstructed.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. My concern is regarding the showpiece, which is the hub. I live at 1515 South Prairie. A little insight into the neighborhood. I'm sure many would agree. If you're on our street, it's because you live there or you're lost. So here's the takeaway. Hub to me sounds like mass entrance and mass exodus. And that 15th Street is going to be a huge drop-off and pickup. Who is accountable for the security and safety of the neighborhood? Is it the owner of the space? We deserve to know. Second, when they're done dropping them off, they're going to go through Prairie and all those townhomes. Major concern. I don't do traffic. I apologize. I don't have solutions. I have serious concerns with the congestion and the approach real people are going to take to gain access to your hub. It's not going to be walking. It's not only going to be walking. People are going to be dropped off constantly. The total vibe of the area will be shifted. And I'm concerned about the safety and security of that area.
Thank you. That was I don't even want to speak, but that was like the second, someone else also spoke, so I'm glad that you raised that and that you respond to that.
Sure. Safety and security in all the respects that you mentioned and many others is going to become one of the dominant issues that we and you and many others will want to have good solutions for. It's certainly one of the areas that technology is is most active around this type of development. There's a whole new era of urban safety and security issues and solutions that I think we're going to find as we get deeper into the plan for this development. I can't speak to your exact points and concerns this evening, other than to say it is a dominant issue in everything that we will do with this project, and it's something that, again, we would hope that we can work with the community and the neighborhood to address.
And I want to say that I heard you about the drop-off, because I know that during Bears games, for example, that's a problem like at 18th and other locations along the area. So I hear you on that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm at 1335 South Prairie. Can you pull up your rendering of the tall buildings? I understand, Alderman, that you said that our views would not be obstructed, but it didn't look that way on that rendering. So can you pull it up and can you commit to no high-rise being built in front of 1335? Right there, that's us right there.
Yes.
So the building would be south of 14th Street, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. How far south? 14, like 1401 or 15? What are we talking about here?
South. I'm not going to try and put a dimension on it at this time, but south of that intersection with McFedrin.
All right. And you know, I do have the population density in the South Loop, again, it's going to be an incredible issue for its residents to deal with. And I'm really hoping that there'll be some consideration for the height and size of the buildings, particularly if they're residential. And so I really hope, and this is a question for both you and for Alderman Dowell, I appreciate you bringing us together this evening. But I want to know, what are the steps? We've shared all of our concerns. How are they going to be considered? What's the process by which we can have real input into the design, the decisions that you're making, or is this just, you're going to listen to us and go ahead and do what you want to do?
Did you come in late?
No.
No? Okay, so my commitment was that this is not the first and only look that you get at the project. And what my goal was tonight was to have Mr. Dunn present his proposal, get your feedbacks and concerns. I'm writing those down. I'm sure he's got people here writing down some of the things that they're hearing. Then we're going to continue to have a discussion about that. He's going to go back and do some work, and we'll come back. If you have some specific ideas, you can either contact the developer, you can email me. We will continue to keep you updated on any move that this development team is going to make.
And so is there ever going to be a process where people can actually vote or tell you whether or not we want this to happen or not? You know, I'm just trying to figure out. I appreciate the...
No, I don't do voting.
Okay.
You elected me to represent you. So
right.
I'm going to be working with the developer and also to be working with the community to make sure that we can have a win-win. You know, I always talk about win-win. That's for this neighborhood, for the broader city of Chicago. And that's my commitment.
And I trust you, Ms. Dowell. Thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Alderman Dowell, for holding this meeting. I had a comment and then a question. So when I bought my unit, the condo, the property report included a lot of information that made it clear that the development was going to happen. I think it was front page in Cranes that Mr. Fogelson was planning to do this development back in 2015. So this is not a surprise at all to me. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in the neighborhood. Our concern, or what it should be really, is that it's the best development possible. Not that there is or isn't a development, it's going to happen some way, somehow, sometime. That's my comment. But the question is that the view corridors, I think they're 109 feet CCD.
What is CCD?
That's Chicago City Datum. It's an elevation standard that the city uses.
That's right.
The metro tracks are approximately 15 to 20 CCD, is that Can you tell us what the 80 feet is in reference to? Is it 80 CCD, 80 feet above grade level?
That's right. I mean, not exactly, but in that neighborhood, it's in reference to CCD.
So
Right, if you start at 50, right, if 15 were 0, and you're at 109, you net the 15 off the 109, and that gives you the height that we can build within for all that structure from grade up to the, the underside of that viewport region.
Okay, so when you say that 80, you mean approximately 100 CCD?
If it's 109, let's call it 15, you're down to, 94.
Okay, all right, thanks.
CCD.
That works for me, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, hi. With approximately 9 or 10 high-rises, each one of them might have about 300 to 500 units with this height. That means it will approximately bring 2,000 to 5,000 new families to the area. What are the plans to expand elementary school and high school? Because currently South Loop Elementary has a capacity slightly under 800 kids.
Now, starting in September, Southwood Elementary will have a capacity of 1,700.
Great. What about the high school?
The high school, yes.
High school, National Teachers Academy, with the closure, and Jones is a magnet school, and it's already overcrowded. Are there plans to put new high school, maybe in this development? Because obviously there will be no more kids.
All right, so the National Teachers Academy, the judge ruled that it had to remain an elementary school. So I'm committed to finding a high school, trying to get a high school in the South Loop that serves the South Loop community. I have talked with Mr. Dunn. I have taken him to meet with CPS, and we are discussing the possibility of some kind of high school on this site.
That's correct. Alderman Dowell said we've started a series of discussions. I said earlier in the presentation that it's my belief that education learning will be a part of this project. It's something we want to start to look at in a much more serious way now that we begin to move forward with the project. You're absolutely correct in saying to the extent that we bring more residents to this location, education becomes probably the most valuable asset to those residents, or certainly a certain sector of those residents. And to the question earlier about property values, education is one of the best ways that we can strengthen the neighborhood in terms of property values. So don't have a specific answer at this point in time, but we are committed to working with Alderman Dowell and the community to try and find an effective way to bring education in as part of the program.
Thank you. We just really need a school. Children have to go somewhere.
Absolutely.
You are 110%, 1,000% right.
Thank you. The second question was also about trucks on Lakeshore Drive, because as far as I understand now, trucks are not allowed on Lakeshore Drive. Will it be possible to use existing metro, not trucks, but there is that passage for buses, that metro lines, metro roads for construction trucks? Because Lakeshore Drive is going to be a disaster with the construction drive.
That is one of the things that we're exploring. There's issues that come with that, but it's definitely one of the things that we're exploring.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Alderman and sir, for having this meeting. I wanted to, number one, because I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of thoughts and want to think about this, find out if there's a centralized way to give information to both the developer and the alderman as to both concerns and ideas.
In projects like this, you do get a lot of input. What we found to be one of the more effective ways to gather that input is as of today, we've activated the website for the project. We welcome, we have comment cards this evening. We'd like to collect any comments that you have on those. And we also would encourage that any of you that have interest in sharing your ideas, your comments, your thoughts, your vision, your experiences with us directly. The website is one very effective way for us to do that. And then in addition to that, as this process begins to move forward, one of the things that we have planned and that we've generally done with these projects is to begin to host a series of topic discussions. We've always found it to be more effective if we break meetings like this down to really focus on specific topics, where we can take an issue like view quarters, we can take an issue like traffic, we can take an issue like density, and we can bring specific focus with you to those issues. Rather than trying to sit down and have a meeting and talk about 100 different issues, we'll try and break it down so we can really get at the essential topics that we know will be important. And from those meetings, we'll gather up what we learn in the communication that we get, and we'll use that to begin to build this community development plan that we'd like to organize as this process moves forward.
And given the amount of people, I just want to raise a quick concern. I live at 1335 South Prairie, and we are kind of a dead end right now, so I would, it's not just Bears games. Bears games have been going on forever, but we have Rolling Stones, Taylor Swift, Northerly Island runs. I mean, you cannot, I'd love to have you all over anywhere between May and October on a weekend and see the problems that do already exist. So in front of 1335 South Prairie, we own that's a private road. And I just foresee, right now we get all these wanderers coming, thinking they can get over to Soldier Field or Northerly Island or wherever, down 14th Street. But if you have a dedicated access, it's not a road equipped for access 14 or the roads Prairie, that someone else brought up, or the road in front of our house, which is a private drive.
Right.
So I think that's got to be addressed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Ma'am, you can also email, you have ideas, you can email me as well, just so that I'm aware of some of the things that you're talking to the developer about. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a real estate broker, and I have a property on the market at 1515 Prairie. It just came on a week ago, and we got a full price offer. And once the conversation came up about this development, they withdrew. And I want to know going forward if is there a specific minimum distance between the properties on Prairie and when a structure, and how far the next structure will be built on the new development? Does that make sense?
I think I understand your question. As we begin to advance the design, I think one of the issues that we want to quickly get to are, what are the dimensions of the structure in volume, right? What is it in sort of an east-west, and what is it in terms of grade, whether we use CCD or we use grade? I'd like to get to a point where we all have a better understanding of what is that physical footprint that we anticipate in getting to the platform, and then as time goes on, we'll begin to think about and identify where are those vertical buildings positioned, how tall, how wide, et cetera.
So there isn't a minimum set distance between the structure, let's say 1515 Prairie, and where something can be built in front of it? Like, is that a standard? Like, it needs to be 200 minimum square, or 200 minimum feet, or is it just figure as the plan progresses, it could be 50 feet, it could be, who knows?
At this point, there's no, identified standards that we're working with. If I understand where you're at, you run along the CN line, so you've got a certain setback and a property dimension that, is dictated, right, in a survey and what have you. On the other side of that, right, where we anticipate building structure, I would anticipate we'll have a similar, setback that we have to respect there.
Thank you. Yes, sir?
Yes, I think one good thing coming out of this is I think the discussion around a more comprehensive South Loop transportation plan. I think between this project, the 78, in actuality, if you look at the land and single-story structures, say south of Roosevelt down I-55, there's probably actually more land to be developed in between the 78 and here. And so I think the important part of this is looking at the transportation on a bigger picture, because, I think with the 78, where they're just trying to drop that red line station in there, you have to ask yourself, is $600 million on one little station serving a sliver, your goal, or should you, putting that more into a more comprehensive transportation plan that joins that site, joins this site, alleviates some of these road issues, because that's not going away regardless if this project happens or not. We all sit on the summer, we sit in Roosevelt Road, and that's not going away, and there's nowhere else to build a road. So I think the transportation aspect of this and having somebody overarching looking at this and directing that is critical, and just want to see more about that.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Make no plans. You guys really didn't stop short in that regard. It's actually pretty exciting and pretty refreshing to see a lot of these mega projects, even in conceptual form, come forward right now. It's this type of grandiose thinking that you see in places like Asia or the Middle East, and the U.S. has largely sort of fallen by the wayside. And Chicago's really bucking that trend. So it's really great that you're coming in with this really large, grandiose plan so that we can start thinking big and then start picking apart the small details. And something is going to be built here, as was mentioned. Those entitlements were set back in the 90s when Central Station was planned. And when it was planned, it was supposed to be much more mixed use than it ended up as. So it's not surprising people that became accustomed to the quiet residential nature of it find this a little jarring. But the intent of this area originally was for mixed use, higher density, and air rights as part of that package. And going forward, I hope that we can work together. I hope the community could be open-minded as this becomes something beautiful, really an asset for the entire city. And I'm sure the illustrative purposes with those really tall structures was to emphasize those view corridors, but also making those buildings as thin as possible to limit that impact on the neighbors. But that also does mean you have to be flexible on height allowances. So my questions are, with the transportation hub, which is among one of those components that's going to be a really big asset to the entire city at large, are you guys building out all of that infrastructure, the track platforms and all of the structure and accessibility that comes with it on your dime? Or is there still yet to be a public-private partnership element where CTA, Metro, and Amtrak are going to be chipping in for part of that budget? And second question comes down to tax revenue. As a city property taxpayer who got a nice little sticker shock in the mail with a 30% assessment increase, and looking at the pension accruals 2-3 years down the road, really going to hammer us. I'm a little terrified as to what the city finances are going to be, where the revenue is going to come from. So it's really refreshing as well to see these big projects coming in. They're going to help pay the bills in the future. And have you done a preliminary calculations on how much revenue this could generate at full build out?
A lot of good questions there. Let me see if I can pick those apart and address them. Number one, with respect to the financing of the project, I said earlier, it is not our intent to use TIF. It has always been our intent that this will be a privately financed project with respect to the civic infrastructure component that we're looking at. That said, it's an economic development initiative of size and scale. With that, there's a very significant fiscal impact that results from that. We do believe that there are opportunities to explore in terms of public and private participation in that. Having said that, I do not expect at this point that it would involve funding from CTA, Metro, the RTA, what have you. So that's the thinking that we've had thus far. We are doing a lot of work right now, actually, to begin to measure what are the fiscal and economic impacts and how will those, in a positive way, create an engine for growth for the city that can help to address some of the fiscal realities that the city is facing looking forward. I think the other comment I would make, sort of responding to some of your comments, is any analysis that you do, any planning that you study, Chicago is going to continue to grow. We're at a point in time in this country where we're beginning to see a reurbanization at a pace that we've never seen before. And I would suggest that we're at the leading edge of that. And the pace of development and urban scale is going to change dramatically in our cities, which is going to mean traffic, congestion, safety and security, schools. amenities. We can either plan for that in our cities and try and move ahead of that, which is really what we're here to talk about tonight is, we have studied this site and issues, both opportunities and constraints. And really what we're trying to do is find a smart way to organize a plan and a project for a site that always had been planned for significant urban, dense economic development. We think we're at a point here, and we've at least opened up, the ideas that can create better development, not reactive development. I think it's fair to say this area is going to see, set this side aside, this area is going to see a continuation of growth and development. And so it's our belief that this development can help in many ways to begin to relieve some of that development pressure. There's not a perfect answer. I'm never going to stand in front of you and say, take our word for it, this development is going to solve all problems. Not possible. But we do see many opportunities where this development and some of the ideas that we've shared tonight can have positive impacts within the neighborhood, the broader community, and the city overall.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You said that you can't solve all the problems, but this is really addressing you, Alderman Dowell. It's a request to you, and it's also a request to you, Mr. Dunn, that right now, anytime Columbus Drive gets closed down, the entire community becomes gridlocked. And there has been a lot of talk and ideas over the years of burying Columbus Drive, and for that matter, burying Lakeshore Drive, so that people who are going through the area are not bogged down into a bottleneck or gridlock. So just the way you took Roosevelt and Clark went underneath so that Roosevelt could have better traffic flow, the same thing could be done at Columbus and Lakeshore Drive in order to allow the traffic to move, because it's already gridlocked right now. And the Chicago Park District is not going to stop closing down Columbus because of events. So my request to you is this: since we're having such a big vision, and this is an amazing vision in so many ways, especially on the transportation side, and I realize that this is outside of the scope of your piece of property. But Alderman, as long as we're going this big, why can't we, you, the city, make real sense of this and take Columbus and Lakeshore Drive underneath and allow flow to the South Loop? Because this, even though everyone, you're going to cut down on automobile traffic, you're not going to get rid of the cars. And truth be said, you're going to have a lot of people coming to this destination off of Lakeshore Drive and coming down Roosevelt Road. And so I'm asking and requesting that maybe the conversation be broadened to consider looking at addressing Columbus and Lakeshore Drive.
Thank you very much. Yes?
How you doing? Can you go up the view corridor slide here? So we live in 1801, and I understand the view corridor was there when we moved in. So my question is, you use the word intent to honor what's there. Do you intend to modify them at some point in time? If you commit that you're not going to modify those?
No.
You won't commit that you're not going to try to modify?
I'm sorry. We will not modify the view corridor either.
Okay, very good. And my second question is, this 3,000 unit of housing, is it going to be apartments or condos?
I don't believe I said 3,000 units of residential. What I can say is I think residential will be a significant part of the development here, and I believe over time it will be a mix of condominiums and rental.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I have an added question about the taxes, and I think we all are here just to educate ourselves about the taxes. So, thank you. Hi. With that, based on your experience, whether Mr. Dunn or Alderman, without this development, as the gentleman said, we've already experienced a significant increase in our property taxes for a variety of reasons. Like you said, the South Loop is just entering a new school. We have a city on fire. So with this development, in your experience, do you know historically what the impact is to individuals from a property tax perspective for paying for some of those additional city services that will be needed to support this effort?
I can't say specifically I don't believe that anyone's individual property taxes are going to be impacted specifically as a result of this development. City finances, cover a broad spectrum of issues. What I can say,
Directly come down to property taxes.
what I can say is, because we do not have a plan to use TIF, this has a very significant positive economic impact to the city of Chicago from day one.
Sure.
Unlike, many, many big projects. So I would position it just the opposite of what I understand your question to be. I believe that this is a project that will add in a very positive way to city economics to take burden off existing taxpayers.
I was going to add to that, I say the same thing. The levy is the levy, and the more real estate we have to contribute to the levy, the more pressure it takes off the individual taxpayer.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi, couple thoughts. I come from the school of thought that just because you can doesn't always mean you should. It seems like an awful narrow parcel of land to try to wedge all this into, and I get that, sometimes people buy something stupid. I buy a lot of stupid stuff. Whoever bought these air rights, to me it seems plausible that if this doesn't work, that they should just eat the money or sell it back to the city or something. If that doesn't happen, then you talked about property prices going up 20%, which I don't know how you arrive at magical thinking like that, but let's just say that does happen. Would you be willing to earmark some of that money to buy out some of the people in the immediate area who are not interested in seeing this circus come to town?
Yeah, I don't think we would anticipate that we would be buying units from people.
But a 20% investment, a 20% profit over time would be a good investment for you, no?
Well, we've got a pretty sizable investment ahead of us.
Right, but we're only talking, you're going to be outlaying billions for this, right? But we would be talking about a few $100 million just to make a few people kind of go away and be quiet. Or
Just a few $100 million.
I don't think I can answer your question satisfactorily.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. One else, with this process and this development, and there's no entrance coming from the west, the city of Chicago is perfectly fine with stopping traffic on Lakeshore Drive for turnoffs for this entire piece of property for entrances and exits and stopping traffic, more than it is anywhere else on Lakeshore Drive. Has that already been discussed in the city hall?
This is not discussed because we have not taken a plan to the Department of Transportation to have them review and evaluate this particular proposal. I'm starting with the community this evening and getting your feedback, and at some point we'll have to have the CDOT weigh in on that question.
Okay, because I see that as not truly an option. I work above Union Station.
Dunn, would you like to, from your experience being with CDOT in the past, can you maybe help answer that question a little bit?
Can you quickly give me the question again?
With this property being developed and no entrance coming from the west, the city of Chicago is perfectly fine with stopping traffic on Lakeshore Drive. We build private entrances and exits to this property.
Okay, so let me address a couple things. Number one, as everyone said, it's preliminary. We've not completed any sort of traffic study or
It's
whatever.
either that or it's coming in from the west. It's one of the two.
So it's all, and I'm trying to answer your question, so if you give me 1 second. Okay, so the reality of life is that the entrances will be off 18th and McFetrich, but there's an entire service road that they're going to build also under for all the entrances and exits for all the buildings. So all the circulation is happening off of city streets is the way it's planned right now. And I'm not sure if that answers your questions. So there's an entire road that's going to parallel Lakeshore Drive for all the driveways and everything else. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm sure we'll have to see.
And the other thing is that at the end of the day, CDOT's going to review all of this. They'll approve it all. I guarantee you, whatever we come up with, there'll be changes.
Again, I work above the building, I work in the building above the Union Station, and it is a mess with the homeless and all that traffic coming in, and we're talking about building a hub in the middle of a neighborhood. That is nothing but disaster and problems and potential injury and murder and death. So you want to bring all these people coming in from all over the city of Chicago to a dead end to the park, to the lake, or just walk into the neighborhood on Prairie Avenue or Indiana and figure it out. That's ridiculous. It's abhorrent.
Thank you for your comment. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that it doesn't seem like it's a good business idea for you because there are so many apartments that we already have in the neighborhood that are in excess, that are not populated. The central station took me years to sell. So where do you think this demand is coming from? I mean, 50 million people that are coming to the civic institutions, I mean, they're coming now, and they're not populating the large buildings that are already built around the city. So as a businessman, I just want to know, how is it that you're estimating your demand?
Well, we've done, across the different programmatic elements that we're looking at, we have done market studies. One thing I would ask you to recognize is this is a long-term development, no different than Central Station as it's been developed today. Not all of this is going to be built at any one period in time, point in time, and frankly, no building will go up if there's not a market there to support it. So, as I said earlier, Chicago is going to see considerable growth in the urban core, and I would argue that you're going to see growth in the urban core of the city at a faster pace than you've seen it over the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So you mentioned that this is a long-term project, and I know as far as timing, it's hard to say right now. But I was wondering about the phases of the project and when the first phase might actually take place as far as breaking ground. Just high level, could you answer that?
Yeah, let me answer the piece that I think I can put some reference around is, we started construction tomorrow on that platform, on that what I call the civic build. That's about a 3-year construction process to get up to that point where you've got that retail dining entertainment. How long it takes us to get from today to that point where you can start construction, very hard to answer. Whether it's next weeks or months, I mean, it's not weeks. I couldn't answer that. As I said, we're approaching this project differently. We want to do it in a way that we're respecting the interests of the community. We want to learn from that and build a plan that is a smart plan that does as much as we can do to represent, all of the interests of the community. That will take time. I just can't tell you tonight exactly how long that will take, but once we're through that process, we've gone to the city, we've met the demands of CDOT and all the other agencies, and we're at a point where we can start construction. That first phase will take about 3 years to construct, and then, I imagine that this is about a 15-year project beyond the point in time of building that podium. So by the time you're done, it's a 15 to 20-year project.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. First question is, could you go back to the site plan real quick? So I'm at 1901 South Calumet, and I'm curious, I know several people have asked about the height of the structures here. So the half moon structure that's right to my east, you're saying that's about 105 feet or about 100 feet, right?
Well, if you net out this CCD, it was a good point that was made earlier. That building there, in this zone where the view quarter easement exists, is under the height that is established for the view quarter easement.
So that's right under that view quarter.
Exactly.
So what about that structure kind of in the center of that half moon shaped thing there?
Here?
It looks like, some type of path, like walkway or something. Like, what's the height of that structure? Because that looks like taller.
Conceivably, it could be could be a little taller. You know, a building of that size and dimension probably isn't an efficient building to build in a tall capacity, but there is no building designed here now. What we know is that in areas like this and this, where we have the view quarter easement, if the floor is a certain elevation, and my hand is what the literal recorded height is above which the view quarter easement is in place, that in those areas where we show these lower buildings, they stay below that point that's defined by the view quarter easement.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, several people have already voiced their concerns, and the
Right.
same, because at the northeast corner of my building, so I'm looking at this and I'm basically going to be blocked. You know, if you have a structure that's about 100 to, let's call it 100 to 110 feet, then I'm not seeing anything, much of anything. It might be right below the view corridor, but I won't be seeing too much. So that's one. Number two, would you go to the slide that shows the height of the taller buildings? I think this might be the traffic slide or something. The view corridor slide, yes, thank you. So if I look at this, I know you mentioned that you don't have any firm designs yet, but obviously you guys own the area rights. You don't own the land. So if I look at the shape of all the tall buildings here, it looks like the actual top of the building is, I guess, the size-wise is actually bigger, so it's smaller at the bottom, right? Because maybe it's because you can build as wide as the rail tracks are, but looks like you're projecting that the building is actually going to go wider.
No, actually.
Or is that not the understanding?
All those massing studies are showing is a physical space that goes from a certain elevation up, and it doesn't change in dimension. What will happen, however, is the opposite of what you described. No building, it would be very unusual to build a building that has a facade that's exactly the same as it rises up. As a building's built vertically, it's gonna step in. It's not gonna blow up.
Okay. Well, I think there's one in or somewhere that has a building that's actually like that.
Possible. I'm not going to say.
It's
got a structural engineer sitting in front of me.
I understand that's unique. I'm not an engineer either. So thanks for answering those questions. I guess my last one is, I have a lot of people have lived here for a long time, which is great. I moved in here about 2 years ago when I bought my condo, and one of the things that's attracting me to this area is because it's quiet. I don't want to have shopping centers and mass transit around me. I mean, I used to ride, Dowell to work, and there are too many weirdos on Dowell. I can't imagine you bringing like a orange line with a brown line coming in here, and the social people that are going to be wandering around the neighborhood. And it's just, iconic. I think I echo the concerns that people have on safety. The sheer mass of people that are going to be around here. That's not why I want to live here. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hi,
We're down to the last three.
another, this is your real limiting factor at all, how tall the building can be. I live in 1629 South Prairie, and, floors, and rumors have always circulated that the height of that building was limited because they wanted to limit the ability to peer into Soldier Field. I just wonder if that's true or false.
I don't believe that.
So obviously that would impact the height of those buildings.
I don't believe that to be true from any kind of an easement standpoint or anything like that.
Alderman, do you know?
No.
I don't know if it's true or false, I just wondering if you had any input.
Yes, sir.
Yes, about 93%. There was a lady here who asked about the amount of residential units and occupancy right now in the central area as a whole. About 93% of the units, condo and rental, are occupied. My question for you, Alderman, you've dealt with a lot of approvals of high rises in your ward, and with making those approvals, have you ever based your decision on someone's objection because of their views being blocked?
I've never, of the high-rise developments that I've worked on in the South Loop since I've been in Alderman, there's never been an issue with view corridors except for the NEMA. And that issue, which did not have a protective view corridor, and that we were able to work with that developer to change the level of the platform that was supposed to go in the middle.
you mentioned, Nima, for the developer. I know you don't have a ballpark figure just as of yet, but you don't have a specific number as of yet, but do you have a ballpark figure as to the amount of square footage you're looking to build? Like the 78 is gonna have about 13 million, Lincoln Yard's about 14.5 million. What are you thinking of in terms of square footage that you're looking for? And when you redo your images, can you please like rotate Nima because it's driving me nuts?
I will, this is based on a city scale model, but we'll certainly look into the orientation of that building. I think what might be giving it a sense of its historicness and the coloring of it, but we'll certainly look into that. As far as the overall programmatic square footage, I don't have an answer to that. We've got a long way to go before we can determine that. That's going to be a function, frankly, of width, height, all the things that we've talked about tonight. If you look at FAR requirements that dictate the volume of buildings that get built in the city, as I said earlier, if you go through the lakefront area, you have high FARs. And I would say, in many respects, very high FARs. We are not looking at something that meets the upper limit of the FAR zones, in particular along the lakefront, the lakeshore districts that have been developed. So we looked at this a lot and believe this is a site that can support density, but I can't tell you today that it's X million square feet.
Thank you.
Alderperson Dowell, thank you again for holding this meeting tonight. I live at 1600 South Prairie. My concern is in regard to the ingress and egress of the project. And as stated earlier tonight, we're informed that all of that, the ingress and egress, will be off Lakeshore Drive. However, I'm still a little concerned about the ingress and egress for the emergency vehicles. At one time, or not at one time, but for a considerable period of time, consideration, as I'm led to believe, consideration has been given to make Prairie Avenue a dead-end street and use 16th Street for ingress and egress to the project.
Yeah, that plan came up a few years back. I killed it because the community did not want that, and it really didn't make any sense. So in talking to Mr. Dunn and his team, we talked about access from the east and not from the west, and from the proposal that he's presented so far, there's no desire to build a road down 16th Street or down 15th Place or any of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Whew. Bob, I want to thank you for your patience and for taking your time and talking to my community about this proposal that you presented tonight. And I just want to say to the community again that this is a proposal in its infancy. There has been no decisions or approvals provided, and this is not going to be the last time that you will see this presentation and the reiteration or changes that may be made based on some comments that we received tonight. So I want to thank you all for coming. I would ask you all to sign up if you haven't on the email list and make sure that we can stay in contact with you. Again, if you want to view this presentation online, you can go to my website tomorrow morning or tomorrow sometime. I don't know how long it's going to take Brian to put it up, but it's ward03chicago.com. Thank you so much. I want to thank Tony, right? I remember it, the AV man. And I want to thank the McCormick Place MPEA for allowing